On December 10th, 1943, Captain John L. Blackie Porter vanished into the Himalayas. It was his wedding anniversary. The man who built ways to find the lost became someone no one could reach. At home, Ellen Jane Watson kept the date marked, counting days instead of missions. "I'll be back for the next one," he had promised, turning the wedding ring he never removed. Years later, Ellen Vinson would inherit that waiting. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to lose a rescuer to a place that offered nothing back, not even a direction." Before Captain John L. Blackie Porter became a name carried by files and spoken with caution. He was simply a man who believed that attention could keep you alive. Long before war gave him orders or justification, he chose danger on his own terms, close enough to the ground that consequences arrived immediately. He did not believe in luck. He believed in preparation, repetition, and the quiet discipline of doing things the same way every time. In rural Ohio, outside Marysville, his mornings followed a pattern so consistent it bordered on stubbornness. Porter arrived early, often before anyone else, when the field still held the night's dampness and the grass bent under his boots. He cleaned aircraft controls by hand, moving slowly along cables, hinges, and linkages, wiping grease onto a rag already stiff from use. He never rushed. He never skipped a surface. He believed machines revealed their problems if you listened long enough. A mechanic once lingered nearby, watching longer than necessary. "You don't trust anybody else with it?" the man asked. Porter didn't look up. "I trust people," he said. "I trust my hands more." Those habits came from his barnstorming years, when flying meant improvisation without forgiveness. He landed on farm fields marked by fence posts, borrowed flags, or nothing at all. Children chased the sound of engines. Farmers leaned on truck beds, deciding whether to watch or look away. Porter flew low passes that flattened crops and nerves alike. He rolled his aircraft until the horizon disappeared, then pulled out with room to spare. Precision mattered more than bravado. There were no safety nets disguised as confidence. He learned early that danger did not announce itself. It waited quietly, patient, and exacting. That understanding shaped the man Ellen Jane Watson met. They crossed paths at a modest gathering, music echoing too loudly in a borrowed hall. Porter spoke with animation, describing air the way other men described roads or rivers. Ellen Jane listened, curious but cautious. She asked questions that slowed him down, that pulled him out of performance and into honesty. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked one evening. "Tired of flying," he said. "No. Tired of being careful, sometimes." Their relationship settled into ordinary rhythms. Walks after supper, coffee cups cooling on the table. Porter wrote letters even when he expected to be home the same night. He liked leaving words behind, liked knowing something of him stayed even when he moved on. Ellen Jane folded those letters carefully, smoothing the creases after every reading, as if flattening paper could flatten distance. They married without spectacle. A ring, witnesses, a promise, spoken plainly. Porter slipped the wedding band on and never removed it again. When someone joked about metal catching on controls, he shrugged. "I'll work around it," he said. He meant it. That refusal to adapt the wrong thing revealed him. He would adjust technique, not commitment. Ellen Jane learned to read his silences. When his thoughts drifted skyward, it wasn't withdrawal. It was focus. He could be present and already gone at the same time, and she learned not to confuse one for the other. Loving him meant accepting that part of him always leaned forward, toward motion. The day he told her he was leaving for Asia, the house felt smaller. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug long gone cold. Outside, wind moved through bare branches, thin and restless. "I'll be back for the next one," he said. She met his eyes. "The next what?" "Our anniversary." They did not argue about war. They talked about time, how long letters might take, whether she would move closer to family, what waiting would feel like when days blurred together. He promised only what he could imagine keeping. After he left, Ellen Jane counted days, not missions. Each night, she crossed off the calendar square with a pencil, the soft scrape becoming familiar. She set one less place at the table. She folded his shirts and left them where he had last put them. She learned the routines of absence, how quiet could settle into rooms and stay. Porter carried his habits with him. In camps far from Ohio, Under skies that felt heavier, he still cleaned controls by hand. He still checked bolts twice. Other pilots noticed. "You think this thing's going to fall apart?" one asked. "Everything does," Porter replied. "Just not all at once." He wrote when he could, not heroic letters, practical ones. He described heat that soaked through uniforms before noon, the smell of fuel mixed with damp earth. He did not describe fear directly, but it lived between lines, in the things he reassured her about without being asked. He told her he slept when he could. He told her not to worry about rumors. Once, standing beside an aircraft as evening settled unevenly over the field, someone asked him if he ever thought about stopping. Porter watched the sky darken, hands resting on his hips. "Sometimes," he said. "Then I think about who doesn't get found if I do." That sentence mattered, because it came before doctrine, before units, before official language. It was personal, a decision not yet formalized. Ellen Jane sensed that pull even across distance. In one letter, she wrote, "I know you won't choose the easy thing." She did not ask him to change. She asked him to come back. The ring stayed on his finger. He twisted it unconsciously when thinking, a small motion those close to him recognized. It was there when he boarded flights, when he signed forms, when he lay awake listening to engines cool. It anchored him to a future he assumed would still be waiting. I can't pretend I know what it felt like to live in that space, ordinary happiness, pressed against approaching fracture, where love is solid and loss remains theoretical. But the details remain. Cleaned controls, letters written instead of packed bags, a promise spoken quietly and believed. This was not a legend yet. It was a man making daily choices, believing skill carried obligation, believing he could manage risk the way he always had. Before the sky closed, the Himalayas did not wait for war to become lethal. Long before engines cut across their ridgelines, the mountains had already perfected the art of erasing people. Snow swallowed sound. Valleys folded inward until direction stopped making sense. Weather formed, shifted, and collapsed without warning. When aircraft began crossing this terrain during the war, the mountains did not adapt. They simply continued doing what they had always done. For the men assigned to fly the route, everything began with a name that tried to make the distance manageable. The Hump, a word passed between crews with an ease that felt practiced, repeated often enough to seem harmless. It suggested a single obstacle, something you could climb over with enough power and nerve. But once airborne, the nickname fell apart. What lay ahead was not one barrier, but a system altitude, wind, ice, and stone working together, refusing to be mastered, all at once. Aircraft lifted out of the Assam Valley heavy with cargo and expectation. Engines strained as planes climbed toward passes that disappeared into cloud. The temperature dropped quickly. Instruments lagged. Radios crackled, then cut short. Sometimes another crew caught a glimpse, a dark shape banking too steeply, a sudden flash of metal, then weather closing like a door. More often, there was no moment to witness it all. A plane left one point of reference and never arrived at another. There was no formal rescue system waiting for them. When an aircraft failed to return, its disappearance became the record. Losses accumulated faster than explanations. At command posts, boards crowded with grease pencil marks tracked aircraft that had departed and not returned. Each morning, yesterday's certainty was erased to make room for today's missing. Names appeared briefly, then gave way to numbers when space ran out. It was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. Someone had to decide what could still be addressed and what could not. And those decisions were made far from the mountains, in rooms where the floor was level and the air did not move. One officer, flipping through a log, said quietly, "Weather closed it in." Another paused, then replied, "There's no way to get anyone up there." That was often the end of the conversation. The route punished predictability. Winds at altitude shoved aircraft sideways, sometimes faster than their own airspeed, pushing crews miles off course without a visible reference to correct against. Ice formed rapidly on wings and propellers, stealing lift a layer at a time until control vanished. Engines overheated under the strain, then failed, leaving pilots seconds to choose between slopes that all looked the same. Below them lay forests dense enough to absorb impact. Trees swallowed sound. Wreckage disappeared beneath growth within weeks. Even if someone survived the crash itself, the terrain worked against them immediately. Smoke dispersed. Signals went unanswered. Direction meant little without landmarks that stayed still. Crews adapted because they had no choice. They memorized ridgelines and valleys. They learned how cloud behaved around certain peaks, which slopes hid turbulence, which passes funneled wind into sudden violence. They watched for the unnatural glint of metal against rock, the one thing that didn't belong. On clear days, sunlight caught twisted aluminum, scattered along ravines and slopes. Wing fragments, fuselage skins peeled back by impact, engine parts torn open and bleached by weather. Those wrecks became reference points, grim and unavoidable. "See that shine?" a co-pilot said once, pressing his forehead to the glass. "Yeah," the pilot answered. Means were drifting right. The aluminum did not mark graves officially. It marked experience. Over time, pilots began referring to the route by another name, spoken half as a warning: the aluminum trail. It was not on maps. It existed only in memory and peripheral vision, in the way crews adjusted course when light hit metal where it shouldn't. Each piece of wreckage was a reminder that someone else had been there and not made it through. Lost statistics circulated quietly through briefings. Tons of cargo delivered per aircraft lost. Men per 1,000 tons. Ratios designed to measure efficiency, not grief. Each number concealed a routine interrupted mid-motion. A hand reaching for a throttle. A checklist left unfinished. A joke cut short. But numbers move faster than bodies, and the war demanded movement. There was an understanding among crews that some places were simply beyond help. The Himalayas were one of them. Attempting rescue under those conditions risked compounding loss: more aircraft, more crews, more cargo gone. Better, some argued, to accept the loss and keep flying. Supplies reaching China mattered. Momentum mattered. No one wrote that down as doctrine. It lived in practice. For families, the consequences arrived slowly. A telegram came first. Then days passed. Then weeks. Letters stopped without explanation. Rumors filtered through communities, thin and contradictory. When inquiries were made, responses came back, measured and careful. Search efforts had been limited. Terrain was prohibitive, weather unfavorable. The language explained without promising. Waiting stretched into a routine of its own. For the men still flying, the knowledge settled into their bodies. Harnesses were pulled tighter. Engines were checked longer. Jokes grew louder before takeoff, as if sound itself could push back what waited above the clouds. Humor became armor. "I don't plan on being one of those markers," someone said once, forcing a grin. "No one does," came the reply. Everyone understood the odds. The mountains accumulated wreckage without ceremony. Instruments froze where they had been left. Maps disintegrated. Fabric rotted away. Aluminum endured, reshaped slowly by ice and gravity. Over time, sequence dissolved. A wing from one aircraft lay beside an engine from another. Evidence lost its order, its ability to explain what had happened first. There was a procedural calm that followed each loss. Flights continued. Cargo moved. Boards were updated. The system adjusted around what it could not fix. Disappearance became a condition rather than a failure. I can't pretend I know what it felt like to fly, knowing that if you went down, the sky might be the last thing anyone ever saw of you. But I can see how that knowledge shaped behavior, how survival became personal, while abandonment became administrative. Rescue, when it happened at all, was accidental rather than planned. This was the void that swallowed men and machines together. A landscape defined not by malice, but by limitation. A place where loss did not require explanation, only altitude. And this was the world into which John L. Blackie Porter flew a route already trained to erase people long before anyone insisted that going after them should be a responsibility instead of a risk. Ellen Vinson did not inherit a body, a grave, or even a photograph that could anchor her to a moment she had lived through herself. What she inherited was a story that stopped in midair and never resumed. She grew up knowing the name John L. Blackie Porter, long before she understood why it carried weight. He was not her father by blood, but he occupied a quiet space in the household that never fully emptied. He existed in the pauses her mother kept when his name surfaced, in the way certain dates were observed without explanation, in the careful handling of old envelopes whose paper had gone thin from being opened too many times. Ellen Jane Watson did not speak about Porter often. When she did, she chose her words carefully, as if precision might preserve him. Dates mattered. Phrases mattered. The way he had said things mattered. He said he'd be back, her mother told her once, smoothing a letter she already knew by heart. Not like a promise you repeat, just like a fact. As a child, Ellen Vincent accepted this the way children accept weather. Present, unchangeable, not yet interrogated. Porter was part of the house without being in it. His absence was not dramatic. It was structural. It was only after Ellen Jane died that the responsibility shifted. Ellen Vincent found herself holding folders instead of memories. Official correspondence, yellowed clippings, carbon copies of letters written in language that explained nothing while sounding definitive. Porter existed now as fragments, a name on a memorial wall in Manila, a line in a loss report, a designation stamped across a page, unrecoverable. For decades, that word had done the work of an ending. It was how institutions closed doors gently. It was how families were expected to stop asking. But it never sat right with her. She began reading everything again, not as someone seeking comfort, but as someone looking for seams. Official reports repeated themselves too cleanly. Terrain prohibitive. Search not feasible. No further action possible. The phrases migrated from document to document unchanged, as if copied rather than reconsidered. The maps unsettled her most. Coordinates shifted slightly between reports. Descriptions relied on landmarks that no longer existed or had never been fixed to begin with. Distances were approximate. Directions conditional. "I don't think they ever knew where he went down," she said once, speaking aloud to an empty room. That realization changed the nature of her waiting. It was no longer passive or inherited. It became deliberate. Ellen Vincent did not begin with a plan. She began with questions. Who decided the search was finished? On what evidence? And why did certainty appear strongest where information was thinnest? She soon learned she was not alone. Other families carried similar doubts, similar folders. Names of the missing changed, but the language around them did not. In those conversations, one name surfaced again and again: Clayton Cools. Cools was not a government investigator. He did not work behind desks or issue conclusions from afar. He was a climber, an expedition leader, someone who believed that answers lived where events had happened, not where they were summarized. His organization, MIA Recoveries, Incorporated, operated on a simple premise. If a site had not been physically reached, then a case was not finished. When Ellen Vincent first contacted him, she did not lead with legacy or heroism. She asked about coordinates. She asked about discrepancies. She asked what it meant when a site had been declared unrecoverable without ever being located. Cools listened. What caught his attention was not Porter's rank or reputation, but the absence of a confirmed crash site. Reports placed the loss broadly, not specifically. Search efforts had been declared complete without physical confirmation. To Cools, that suggested something unfinished. "There's still ground no one stood on," he said plainly. Their early conversations were cautious. Ellen Vincent had learned not to trust momentum. She asked what he could actually do, where he would begin, what would happen if nothing was found. Cools did not promise resolution. He promised effort. He would go to the villages. He would listen. He would follow what people remembered, not what paperwork insisted. And if there was nothing left, he would say so. That mattered. In Arunachal Pradesh, history did not live in archives. It lived in memory. Cools moved on foot through terrain that resisted documentation. Steep slopes, unstable ground, paths that existed only because people continued to walk them. Local guides measured distance in hours, not miles. Villages appeared where maps showed blank space. Elders spoke of metal birds that had fallen long ago, of fires seen on mountainsides, of places children were warned not to approach. These stories were not told dramatically. They were offered the way people offer directions: practical, unembellished, anchored to place. One guide stopped on a ridge when the clouds lifted briefly and pointed to a slope across a ravine. "Old crash," he said, "very old." The coordinates Cools recorded there did not match those in American records. They were close, but not close enough to dismiss. Close enough to suggest error rather than fabrication. Back home, Ellen Vincent studied those numbers carefully. She traced them on maps, noting how they fell just outside previously searched areas. It was a small shift geographically, but enormous in implication. If the site lay there, then no one had ever truly gone after Porter. That thought stayed with her. For Kulis, progress came in fragments. Aluminum embedded in soil, pieces scattered downhill, as if gravity had finished what impact began. Each find was photographed, measured, logged. Nothing dramatic. Just accumulation. "There's too much here for it to be nothing," he said once into a recorder, breath audible between words. Ellen Vinson followed the work from a distance. Phone calls came at odd hours. Emails arrived with photographs she opened slowly, as if abruptness might disturb what they contained. She learned to recognize aircraft components by shape, learned serial number formats, learned how long confirmation could take. Searching for a man she had never met did not feel abstract. It felt intimate. She knew his handwriting from letters. She knew how he wore his ring. She knew the promise he had made. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to pursue someone whose life ended before you could speak to them. But I can see how closeness is built through effort, how each climb, each interview, each fragment lifted from the dirt narrowed the distance time had stretched. As evidence accumulated, resistance followed. Permits stalled. Jurisdictional questions surfaced. The terrain was still described as dangerous, still framed as a reason not to proceed. Ellen Vinson learned the language of delay, the way her mother had learned the language of waiting. "Be patient," she was told. "I have been," she answered. Something had shifted. Porter was no longer only a missing man of the past. He was an active case again. His name appeared in emails. His coordinates were debated. His fate was discussed in the present tense. Nothing was resolved. Not yet. What Ellen Vinson and Clayton Kulis had uncovered was not an ending. It was direction. A narrowing of uncertainty. A place where a man's name touched earth again. A name in the dirt. They stood at the edge of something newly possible, aware that discovery often complicates more than it completes. Because finding a place is not the same as finding a person. And proof, once uncovered, has a way of asking harder questions than absence ever did. This was no longer about whether John L. Blackie Porter had vanished. It was about what would happen if he was finally found. December 10th, 1943, did not announce itself as different. There was no sense, in the early hours, that the day would divide lives into before and after. Morning at the airfield came thin and colorless. Cold settled low, not biting, just persistent. Engines coughed awake, one by one. The sound uneven, familiar. Captain John L. Blackie Porter walked toward the briefing hut with his collar turned up, hands tucked briefly into his jacket pockets before instinct took over and he freed them again. The wedding ring on his left hand caught on the fabric. He twisted it once, the same small motion he always made, and continued on. Inside the hut, maps were spread across a scarred wooden table, corners held down with coffee mugs and ashtrays. The smell of fuel clung to everything. A transport aircraft had failed to arrive on schedule the night before. Last known position was approximate, marked by a penciled circle rather than a point. The terrain inside that circle rose sharply. Weather reports were incomplete. A junior officer cleared his throat. "Probably weather," he said, not confidently. Porter leaned closer to the map. What altitude was he last seen at? "No visual," the officer answered. Radio contact just stopped. Porter nodded once. He had heard that phrasing too many times to react to it. The mission was simple in wording and dangerous in practice. Search along the corridor. Fly low enough to see wreckage or smoke. Return with whatever information could be gathered. No rescue deployment was planned. There was no extraction force waiting. This was reconnaissance, under another name. The aircraft assigned was a B-25 Mitchell, serial number 41-30362. It was heavier and faster than the transports Porter usually flew for rescue work, but it carried range, armor, and guns. Enough, on paper, to survive attention. His crew assembled without ceremony. James F. Spain, the co-pilot, adjusted his harness and avoided eye contact, already focused inward. Walter R. Oswald checked radio equipment, tapping connections lightly, as if reassurance traveled through touch. Harold W. Niebler moved methodically through engine checks, calling out numbers that matched expectation. Harry D. Tucker settled into the tail position, enclosed by metal and isolation. Major Ralph L. Dewsnup joined as an observer, quiet, attentive. Porter looked at them once before climbing aboard. "Same job as always," he said. Spain answered, same job. They took off into air that felt heavier than it should have. The search required flying along ridgelines, dipping into valleys where cloud clung stubbornly. Visibility shifted minute by minute. At times, the ground appeared close enough to touch. At others, the world reduced itself to gray movement and instrument readings. Porter flew with restraint, holding altitude just high enough to maneuver, just low enough to see. Spain watched the instruments, calling out changes without being asked. Niebler monitored engines, his voice steady. Oswald attempted radio contact at intervals. Each unanswered call logged more out of habit than hope. Somewhere along the route, the sky changed texture. The light sharpened. Movement appeared where movement did not belong. Contacts, Spain said, already leaning forward. 12 o'clock. Dark shapes cut across cloud with intent. Japanese fighters. Zeros. Fast, agile, numerous. They had not expected to find a lone aircraft moving slowly through this corridor, but surprise evaporated quickly. There was no time to climb, no room to hide. Porter adjusted course, angling the Mitchell to give his gunners a chance. The first burst of gunfire rattled the fuselage hard enough to vibrate teeth. Metal screamed. The aircraft shuddered as rounds tore through skin and structure. One engine flared, then began to fail, its sound changing pitch in a way Porter recognized immediately. Smoke filled the cockpit in sharp bursts, stinging eyes and throat. Engine 2's gone, Niebler shouted. I see it, Porter replied. Tucker fired from the tail, the recoil jarring his body in tight space. Oswald tried to maintain radio contact, voice breaking through interference that no longer mattered. The Mitchell lost altitude despite Porter's effort to hold it level. Spain remembers the moment when choice narrowed to instinct. The aircraft was no longer something to be saved, only managed. Porter kept his hand steady on the controls longer than made sense if he were thinking only of himself. He trimmed the aircraft, leveling it just enough. Get ready, Porter said. Not shouted, directed. The words mattered because of their timing. They came when the aircraft still held together, when escape was still possible for someone. Go, Porter said next. Spain did not argue. He reached for the hatch, the rush of air immediate and violent. He did not see Porter's face. He felt the aircraft dip as he jumped, felt the sudden absence of weight and sound. The parachute opened hard, snapping him upright. Silence arrived abruptly, broken only by wind and his own breathing. Below him, cloud swallowed the aircraft's final path. Spain landed badly. Pain flared in his leg and shoulder, but nothing felt broken. He lay still for a moment, listening. No voices, no engines, just wind moving through trees. Behind him, the B-25 struck the mountainside. Porter, Oswald, Niebler, Tucker, and Dusnup never left the aircraft. Spain's survival did not feel like relief. It felt like obligation. He gathered his chute, oriented himself by instinct and fragments of training, and began moving. Direction was guessed. Progress was measured in exhaustion. He walked for days through terrain that resisted intention. Slopes shifted underfoot. Vegetation tore at clothing. Water was gathered where it could be found. Food ran out quickly. Each step required decision. He avoided villages when possible. He followed streams when he could. He slept lightly, waking at every unfamiliar sound. When he reached friendly forces, his account was brief and restrained. Location approximate. Encounter sudden. Loss total. The report became evidence. Serial numbers were noted. Damage patterns inferred. Spain's survival suggested altitude at exit, timing, discipline. The fact that no one else escaped raised questions no one could answer with certainty. Did Porter choose to stay behind? Did he believe the aircraft needed one more second of control? Did circumstances remove choice entirely? No document resolved that. The mountains offered no clarification. No wreckage could be reached. No debris field examined. The aircraft's final resting place remained theoretical, triangulated through Spain's memory of angles, seconds, and sensation. Spain lived with that day for the rest of his life. He repeated it when asked, careful not to add meaning where none could be proven. He held it steady, Spain said once, years later. That's what I know. I can't pretend I know what it felt like to step out of that aircraft while others remained inside. But I can see how seconds become lifelong companions, how a decision measured in heartbeats stretches into decades of reflection. December 10th ended without ceremony. A mission unfinished, a crew reduced to names. A rescuer who had spent his war going after others, now placed beyond immediate reach. What remained were fragments. A survivor's path through jungle, a serial number written into logs, weapon damage patterns inferred from absence. Not answers, just the outline of what might have happened, and the knowledge that some choices once made leave no witnesses behind. The war ended, but December 10th did not. In 1947, the language finally arrived. Typed, official. Final in tone, if not in effect. The Army's determination was brief and carefully phrased. The remains of Captain John L. Blackie Porter and his crew were declared unrecoverable, terrain inaccessible, no further action planned. For the men who wrote it, the decision closed a file. For the people who received it, it opened something that never shut again. Ellen Jane Watson read the letter at the same kitchen table where she had once counted anniversaries. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from surprise, but from recognition. She had lived with this direction of travel for years. Still, seeing it named felt like a blow delivered after the fall. "So that's it," she said aloud, though no one was there to answer. She folded the letter neatly, the way she folded everything that mattered, and placed it with the others. Life required continuation. Grief learned to coexist with routine. Ellen Jane remarried. She built a household that included laughter again, meals shared, plans made. But certain dates never softened. December 10th never behaved like an ordinary day. Porter remained present in small, persistent ways. His name was not spoken often, but it was never erased. His letters stayed in their drawer. His ring, never recovered, lived instead in memory. Ellen Jane did not describe herself as waiting anymore, but she did not stop listening for news either. Her daughter, Ellen Vinson, grew up inside that atmosphere. She understood early that there was a man she would never meet who still shaped the house. Porter existed as a reference point, someone who had mattered deeply and left without leaving. "He saved people," her mother said once, simply. "And no one saved him?" Ellen asked. Ellen Jane did not answer right away. "They tried," she said finally, "in the ways they knew how." Across the country, other families absorbed the same language. Walter Oswalt's relatives learned to recognize the envelope before opening it. Harold Niebler's family marked his absence with photographs that never aged. Harry Tucker's name appeared on memorials, carved carefully into stone. Major Ralph Dewsnup's circle adjusted around a missing place at tables that had once been full. One of those relatives was Sharon Niebler Kuntz, Harold Niebler's niece. She grew up hearing stories that stopped abruptly. Her family spoke of Harold as someone perpetually in motion, a man defined by competence and humor. The absence left behind was not dramatic. It was constant. "He was supposed to teach me to fish," Sharon remembered being told. That was always how the story ended. For decades, these families lived with a shared condition: knowledge without completion. The declaration of unrecoverable offered neither certainty nor peace. It was an administrative conclusion applied to human lives. Porter's name joined the tablets of the missing at the American Cemetery in Manila. It was a symbolic resting place, not a destination. Ellen Jane visited when she could. She touched the stone once, briefly, then stepped back. "He's not here," she said quietly. At Arlington, a cenotaph was placed in his honor. It acknowledged service without claiming recovery. Visitors paused there, reading his name, perhaps imagining a grave beneath their feet. Ellen Jane understood the distinction too well to be comforted by it. Time moved. Ellen Jane aged. She told fewer stories, but she never revised them. Porter did not become myth in her telling. He remained specific. A man who cleaned controls by hand, a man who promised to come back. When Ellen Jane died, Ellen Vinson inherited the record. Not just the documents, but the unfinished responsibility. The absence became hers to manage. She read the 1947 determination again, this time with distance enough to notice its thinness. It stated what could not be done, not what had been tried. It closed a door without describing the room. "This isn't an answer," she said to Sharon Niebler Kuntz when they first spoke. "It never was," Sharon replied. Their connection formed quickly, grounded in recognition rather than hope. They compared notes. They compared silences. They compared the ways officials spoke when certainty was requested and patience was offered instead. Government correspondence filled binders, polite acknowledgments, references to terrain, promises to notify if circumstances changed. Years passed between updates. Each letter was carefully worded to avoid commitment. Ellen Vinson learned how to read between lines. Still no change in status. One letter read. "Then something's missing," she said, setting it aside. The families did not speak of closure. They spoke of responsibility, of finishing something that had been interrupted. Ellen Vinson began attending WWII family conferences, listening to others describe similar journeys. She learned the vocabulary of recovery accounted for, unresolved, active case. She spoke when given the chance. She did not dramatize. She described a promise made and never tested. "My mother waited her whole life," she told a room of strangers. "I don't intend to." Sharon Niebler-Kuntz became an ally rather than an echo. She brought her own questions, her own insistence that time alone did not absolve effort. Together, they pressed for reconsideration. They wrote letters. They requested reviews. They accepted delays without accepting dismissal. The emotional cost did not appear in records. It showed up in fatigue, in the way each small advancement required renewed energy, in the careful balance between hope and endurance. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to live decades without a body to bury or a place to stand. But I can see how grief changes shape when it has no endpoint, how it becomes something carried rather than resolved, something folded into daily life like an old letter kept close." Porter's absence altered routines long after headlines faded. Anniversaries became markers of loss rather than celebration. Family histories developed gaps that could not be filled with photographs. Children grew up knowing someone mattered deeply, without knowing where he rested. The government called it unrecoverable. The families called it unfinished. By the time Ellen Vinson began looking seriously for ways to reopen the case, she was no longer motivated by belief that recovery would be simple. She was motivated by refusal to accept that no one had truly tried. What recovery meant, after decades, was no longer physical alone. It meant acknowledgement. It meant effort proportionate to sacrifice. It meant honoring the man who had built a way to go after others by going after him in return. The long after did not end grief. It reshaped it. Porter did not return to his family in 1947. He returned as an obligation that outlived paperwork, as a question passed from one generation to the next, as a man whose absence demanded more than a line carved in stone. The declaration had closed a file. It had not closed the story. The mountain did not look like a grave. In 2011, when Clayton Coulis stood on the slope for the first time, there was nothing ceremonial about it. No marker, no clearing, just uneven ground falling away at an angle that made standing feel temporary. Trees pressed in close, their roots gripping soil and stone, as if holding the mountain together by force of habit. "This is it," one of the local guides said, planting his boot carefully. Down there, they moved slowly. Every step mattered. The terrain did not forgive distraction. What Coulis noticed first was not metal, but silence of a particular kind, the way sound flattened when nothing had passed through recently. This place was not visited. It was avoided. Then he saw it. A dull edge of aluminum, half buried, catching light where light did not belong. They did not dig that day. They documented. Photographs first. Measurements. Coordinates. Recorded carefully. Cross-checked twice. Coulis crouched low, brushing away loose soil with his fingers, just enough to confirm what he was seeing. Aircraft skin, warped by impact, then reshaped by decades of rain and gravity. "This isn't drift," he said quietly. "This is a site." The fragments extended downhill, scattered in a pattern that spoke of momentum rather than explosion. Gravity had done its work slowly, pulling pieces away from the point of impact, inch by inch, year by year. Evidence had not disappeared. It had migrated. Then came the object that changed everything. Half hidden beneath leaves and soil lay a small, familiar shape, rectangular, metal, unmistakable. Coulis lifted it carefully, turning it over once before stopping himself. The stamped letters were still legible. Harry D. Tucker. A dog tag. No interpretation was required, no inference. This was proof that could be held. Coulis did not celebrate. He sat back on his heels, the tag resting in his palm, suddenly heavy. Someone else had worn this against their skin. Someone else had last touched it in fear or routine or neither. "That's him," the guide said, peering closer. "That's one of them," Kulas replied. When Ellen Vinson received the call, she asked Kulas to repeat himself. Not because she hadn't heard, but because repetition made it real. "They found a tag," he said again. "Harry Tucker's." She closed her eyes. Not relief, not joy. Something steadier. "So they were there," she said. "Yes." That confirmation altered the balance of the case. Porter was no longer missing in theory. He was present in place, bound to a specific slope, a measurable depth of earth. The mountain had stopped being symbolic. It had become physical. What followed was slower. Permits took years. Jurisdictional negotiations moved at their own pace. The site did not change, but access did. Ellen Vinson learned patience, of a different kind. Active patience, measured in emails sent, calls returned, funds raised. The community in Marysville contributed quietly, steadily. $44,000 gathered, not for certainty, but for effort. By 2019, the excavation was approved. The team assembled without spectacle. Forensic specialists, archaeologists, local guides who knew how to move without disturbing more than necessary. Tools were chosen carefully. Shovels gave way to trowels. Hands replaced instruments whenever possible. They dug to a depth of about 3 feet. Soil came away in layers, damp and dark. Roots resisted, stone interrupted. Every few inches, work paused. Someone photographed, someone recorded, someone waited. Then bone. Not a skeleton, not completeness, pieces. Human remains mixed with aircraft debris, scattered downslope, as if the mountain had continued the work of separation long after the crash. A fragment of skull, a long bone, teeth, each was treated with the same quiet attention. Each was placed into evidence bags with labels written slowly, deliberately. "This wasn't a statistic," one of the specialists said softly. "This was someone's body." Aircraft components emerged alongside them. An overhead hatch distinctive to the B-25, twisted framework, fasteners corroded nearly beyond recognition. These objects did not tell a story in sequence. They confirmed one instead. The excavation did not answer every question. It was not meant to. Whose remains had been recovered could not yet be determined. DNA analysis would take time. Some fragments might never match conclusively. Others might belong to men still unaccounted for. Ellen Vinson understood this before the work began. Finding everything was never the promise, she said. Trying was. For her, the significance lay in the act itself. Someone had gone back. Someone had stood where Porter's aircraft had fallen. Someone had reached into the earth and said, "You are not forgotten." I can't pretend I know what it feels like to hold proof without certainty, to know you are closer and still not finished. But I can see how partial answers can carry weight of their own, how 3 feet of soil can separate indifference from care. Not everyone was found. Not everyone was identified. Some remains likely still lie farther downslope, beyond what could safely be reached. The mountain did not give up everything, but it gave enough. The dog tag was returned to the Tucker family. A small object, worn thin, heavy with years. Sharon Niebler-Kuntz received updates in careful language, learning to read what was said and what remained open. For Ellen Vinson, the site changed how she spoke about Porter. Not as someone lost to distance, but as someone located. Someone whose last moments had a place, a slope, a measurable depth. The rescuer had been reached, not fully, not finally, but deliberately. The excavation ended the way it had begun. Quietly. Tools packed. Soil replaced. The mountain looked the same again to anyone passing by. But something had shifted beneath it. 3 feet down, absence had given way to presence. Not complete, not conclusive, human. And that, at last, was something the mountain could not take back. Captain John L. Blackie Porter never returned the way his family once imagined. There was no procession, no coffin carried across a field, no moment when waiting ended cleanly. What came back instead was something quieter and more enduring. His work survived him. The principles Porter lived by: go low, take risks, don't leave people behind because it's inconvenient, did not stay trapped in 1943. They were absorbed, formalized, taught. Over time, they became doctrine. Modern pararescue forces trace their lineage to choices made by men like Porter, flying without guarantees, believing that rescue was not optional. Somewhere today, a rescue jumper clips a harness, checks gear by hand, and steps into open air for someone they've never met. They do it because someone once insisted that survival should not depend on luck alone. I can't pretend that knowing this erases what was lost. Ellen Jane still waited a lifetime. Ellen Vinson still carried questions that no excavation could fully answer. Bones were recovered, but time was not. Yet there is a kind of return that does not require completeness. Porter comes back each time someone refuses to accept abandonment as policy. Each time risk is taken deliberately, not for glory, but because someone else is still out there. The rescuer did not come home whole, but he did not disappear. He remains in methods taught, in lives pulled back from edges, in the quiet resolve that echoes through generations of those who go looking for others, that others may live.